So Prometheus and PromQL are open source projects, but also kind of a sort of standard of sorts. And there's this concept of being PromQL compatible. We should firstly probably explain what that means. What does PromQL compatible mean?
That is a good question because PromQL doesn't have an official spec document where every feature is described in detail. Basically, the code is the spec. And the reason all of this came up is that PromQL's popularity led other vendors and projects to say, hey, we are also supporting a PromQL compatible interface right now. So you have Grafana Cloud, you have Google Cloud by now, AWS, and even open source projects like or Chronosphere as well, but also you have Thanos, Cortex, other projects, all implementing PromQL as part of their system. And sometimes it doesn't actually work exactly the same way as in Prometheus. Ideally, it does, and then we would say it is actually fully compatible. But some of these vendors, actually, mostly ones that I haven't mentioned now, but there's plenty of others that say they are compatible, often have wildly different results in what a given PromQL query returns and what functions are actually supported, and so on and so on. And I noticed that a while ago, I think 2020 was 2002 would have been a bit early, but 2020 was the first year where I got this idea of actually testing these different vendors and projects. And since there was no official spec, the approach to testing compatibility was to build a reference Prometheus server that is just a normal vanilla Prometheus server to serve as what PromQL actually is supposed to behave like, and have that send the data that it collects to one of these third-party systems. So using the remote write interface or some other compatible interface, and then having a tester tool that runs a whole set of comparison queries against both endpoints. So it sends the same type of query to the reference Prometheus server and the vendor to be tested, gets the results back, does a diff, and for every query then either, if everything behaves exactly the same, then we say that one passed. And it's like hundreds of different test queries. But for the ones that don't return exactly the same results, you then see the exact differences. Sometimes series might be missing, some values might be slightly different, et cetera, et cetera. So I wrote a series of blog posts by now, testing different vendors, explaining how they're different and whether it matters or not, though that try to stay a bit out of that and just try to factually, neutrally report as much as possible, to try to gain, to bring a bit of transparency into the space. And I think the importance of this is that a lot of vendors, especially hosted service providers, but also products you deploy yourself, see a lot of marketing value in being able to say, we support PromQL, which is becoming the lingua franca of time series-based monitoring. And so they have an incentive to say this, even if it's not true. And we want to avoid ecosystem fragmentation. So if a user uses one service but it behaves differently than another, then they cannot switch easily anymore. And so that's one thing. We want to avoid user confusion, right? If a service says they support PromQL, then it should support it really in the same way as the upstream Prometheus server does. Because if it does not, in the worst case, your alert will not generate, like your alerting expression would just silently fail and you might miss an outage, right? That's kind of the worst case. In the slightly more benign case, maybe some curves on a graph would look slightly different. So that's important. And so for us, it's really important to just bring transparency into that space, and make it clear to users when they're choosing a solution, whether it's really PromQL compatible or whether that's more on the marketing speak side.
And are people, obviously this is nothing so official, but are people starting to use it as kind of a a positive or something to strive towards as these different vendors and projects?
I would say so. I mean, even as a result of my different blog posts and testing series, a number of vendors have made improvements. Some only were missing like 1 or 2 test cases or had to fix like 1 or 2 little issues in their service, and now they're 100% compatible, whereas before they were like 99 point something percent compatible. Whereas some other vendors, they're like at still around 70% of test cases actually just working, but still have improved maybe from a much lower number before.